158 days in 2020, more than in any other region in the world. So, but yet the cost and benefits of the suspension of face-to-face instruction remain insufficiently known. There are many questions, but so far data to study them have been quite limited. Although most governments in the region have made substantial efforts to ensure continuing education opportunities through, for example, online lessons, remote teaching plans, broadcast lessons on radio and TV, digital platforms with lessons often performed on PCs and smartphones and printed handouts, we've seen great variation in the capacity to deliver quality learning during the pandemic, and especially for the most vulnerable students, which means that students' educational experiences have been extremely different and therefore contributing to an already unequal and already existing heterogeneity in terms of service delivery. For example, while 86% of students in Uruguay had access to online learning platforms, in rural Peru, only 11% did. Almost half of parents in Bolivia and Colombia report that their children lack access to a device or internet in the household. And so even as most governments in the region report stable enrollments through 2020, challenges have been profound. Rural and disadvantaged schools face especially stark challenges maintaining contact with students in a virtual setting, and therefore is not surprising that learning time has dropped significantly from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic or during pandemic values. For example, according to household surveys, nearly half of students in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru spend less than 2 hours a day on schooling activities. This is based on our analysis, most recent analysis of microdata. Many of these students have lost contact with their teachers and schools, and the situation is likely even worse in poorer countries in the region. So the lack of engagement raises concerns about dropouts and learning losses. While data on overall dropouts has been surprisingly low during school closures, actual data from countries that have reopened schools have been scarce. During the pandemic and virtual learning, it was easy for students to remain enrolled but not engaged in learning. But previous work on dropouts shows that once students fall behind, they cannot imagine catching up and they often drop out. We will only learn the extent of the consequences of school closures on dropout rates when the attendance numbers are released in the coming months. Now, on the learning loss side, during the school closures, we have that the data has also been slow to emerge. For the moment, only 5 countries in the region have conducted comparable national assessments: Brazil, some states and municipalities, and secondary exits. And we've seen secondary exit sums in Barbados, Colombia, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. At the IDB, we have evaluated the impact of school closures on student learning in Colombia and Sao Paulo, and we just received the data for the other countries. From the data that we have right now, we find that students have made little or no progress while learning from home in Colombia. And in Sao Paulo, average test scores decreased by 0.32 standard deviations. Students basically learn 28% of what they would have learned on a normal school year. So, and learning loss, of course, was more pronounced among primary school students in Sao Paulo and among students from disadvantaged homes in both school systems. So I think we can draw 2 key lessons from this information. First, if governments are going to effectively address learning loss created by the pandemic, it is imperative that they conduct assessments to understand the extent of the loss. Thus far, for the moment, only 5 countries in the region have conducted comparable national assessments that allow them to evaluate learning before and after school closure. And that is at the micro level. They will also need to complement that information with formative assessments at the student level to be able to act and personalize learning. And the second lesson, which is a great transition into this panel, is that it is also imperative that government have the most effective evidence-based strategies to support our students' growth and learning moving forward. So moving now into the papers of this session, the great contributions that we're going to share in this session, we have 3 papers. The first by my colleagues, the IDB, Sami Berlinski, Horacio Alvarez, and Matias Busso, that assess the effectiveness of an experiment aimed at improving the reading skills of struggling 3rd grade students in Colombia. They find positive and sustained impacts on reading skills, and the effectiveness increased over time. They also find the intervention to be a cost-effective remediation program compared to other alternatives. The second paper that we're gonna hear today is by Francisco Maimovich, Manuel Vasquez, and Melissa Adelman from the World Bank Group that evaluates the results from a low-cost early warning system pilot in Guatemala, where 40% of 6th graders drop out before completing 9th grade. And they find that program reduces dropout rates between 4 and 9%. And finally, Marta Ferreira shares the results of a recent report by the World Bank with co-authors Lelis Dinarte, Marina Bassi, and Sergio Urzúa. The report, The Fast Track to New Skills, finds that these short programs that focus on the skills demanded by the labor market produce good academic and labor market outcomes relative to incomplete bachelor's degree programs. So I promise to stop here. Let me briefly share some procedural aspects of the session and we'll dive into it. So authors will have 15 minutes each to present their work, and then we'll have a 10-minute session for Q&A. So go ahead, Sami.
There you go. I unmute myself. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mercedes, for that great introduction. That will cut my presentation in 2 or 3 minutes. So this is, I'm going to talk to you about remedial education, in particular about joint work that we carry with Horacio Alvarez. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think we lost you for a moment.
Okay. I'm saying I'm going to talk about joint work with Horacio Alvarez Marinelli from the Education Division of the bank, and Matias Busso, who is at the research department with me. So, you know, the usual disclaimers apply. Mercedes already gave a great introduction of why these are worrying times. They were worrying times before the pandemic. Now, after the pandemic, learning is even at more risk for everybody in the region. So the question is, what can we do in terms of policy interventions? And we can do nothing, okay? And just kids keep going through grades, business as usual, with, of course, the consequence that, you know, they lack basic skills for reading and math, or we can attempt to bring them back to speed. And for that, I'm going to talk about the evaluation of an intervention that was carried in the municipality of Manizales in Colombia with 3rd grade public elementary schools. This is an attempt to remediate or to improve the situation of kids that were struggling to read. Although we know quite a bit about how to do that in individual settings with very well-trained, you know, specialists, it's less clear that this can be done at scales with less qualified tutors. So we carry the evaluation that I'm going to talk to you today is the result of 3 experiments that were carried in 2015, 2016, and 2017 with students in the 3rd grade that were struggling to read. Most children were coming from disadvantaged households and attending school in the usual shift for Manizales, which is between 5 and 6 hours a day. As I said, this is a program sponsored by the Secretaría de Educación, the Alcaldía de Manizales, and Fundación Luker, and the bank as well. So what was this program like? So the program focused on small group tutorials for remediation. Those who have kids in the US or in the UK schools will be used to this type of programs where kids are taken out of the classroom if they are struggling in some subject, and they work with some specialists in order to bring them back to speed. So we implemented something of this sort, and the objective was to improve reading fluency in third graders. The dosage in a model year, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but some of these implementation aspects changed in the 3 different cohorts of the experiment. There were 3 sessions of tutorials per week, with the sessions had at most 6 students. There were 40-minute sessions with distribution of time, about 20 minutes dedicated to improve fluency, and the rest to vocabulary and comprehension. Students were taken out of the classroom during regular school hours. I think that this is important from the policy point of view. The alternative is to have tutorials and remediation after school. I think that we have high attendance rates, and a reason to have high attendance rate is that this is done during school hours. I'm not going to be able to talk about the results in other subjects today, but we find no loss or in performance in other subjects, and if anything, gains. Okay, so I think that when we are thinking about remediation, maybe it's better done during school hours. So the tutors, and that's an important thing, we hired about 15, the NGO hired about 15 tutors that were part-time, that were trained for about 8 hours. They were, as I said, no specialists in remediation, that were people that most of them recently finished their training to become teachers or some related career and had relatively little experience, okay? There was not a lot of investment in terms of materials, just a student workbook and a teaching workbook. The material was first developed international by some international experts, and over time it was improved by a set of local experts, which I think add quite a lot to the success of the program. So the pedagogical approach, I'm not going to say much, but I know that my colleagues in the education department are very adamant that this is the way of doing it. So there was explicit and direct instruction. Okay, so the teacher explained what they were going to do, then they modeled the exercise, then there was a guided practice, and then there was independent practice. In terms of approach to learn how to read, it was mainly a phonemic approach. Okay, with the different strategies that I described there in the PowerPoint. So we, as measures of students' outcomes in this experiment, we're going to use EGRA and EGMA, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about them. But they evaluate different components of how to read and do math, okay? So let me explain how the experiment was done. So before the start of, well, at the start of the school year, okay? Here you have it, at the start of the school year, we collected data on EGRA and EGMA, okay? Then we analyze that data, and the students in a model year, let's say in cohort number 2, the 2016 one, we took students that were reading less than 60 words, and those were the eligible for the program. Then we randomized, then we took out schools that were very small or that were very large just because of logistical reasons. And then we randomized schools to treatment and control status. So that left on average around between 80 and 90 schools per cohort of the experiment. The intervention was carried in the second half of the academic year, and we have results at the end of the third grade. We have results at the beginning of the fourth grade and at the end of the fourth grade for these children, okay? I think that these are the most important things to have in mind. The tutors were assigned to school at random, and the kids were assigned to the tutorials at random when was necessary, okay? If there was more than one tutorial, okay? So this is how the distribution of the fluency of oral reading looks like in year number 2. As you can see, about 30% of the kids in the school on average will read less than the minimum of 60 words per minute, okay? So what were the results of the experiment? That's it. After using this, you can just, go and make coffee and wait for Francisco's presentation. You have so this is a literacy score that adds all the correct answers in EGRA, sorry. So at the beginning, they were both equally bad, if you want. And as time passed, the control group, the treatment group started to gain in respect to the control group, and those gains were sustained from the end of the third grade to the beginning of the fourth grade and the end of the fourth grade. How I'm doing on time, Mercedes? Okay. So just in the interest of time, I mean, these are the numbers. If I run the regressions, and they are all statistically significant, and they look as like if I separate the different components, okay, but I don't want to bother you with this now in the interest of time. So one interesting aspect of the experiment, which, I think that this is something that we need to do much more, is the experiment didn't happen once and we went home and we were happy that it worked well. Actually, the first time it didn't work the way we wanted, okay? So that led to some tweaking of the ways we were doing the experiment, which led to the second try at this remediation. And then after the second try, we were more successful, and that led to the third version of the experiment, okay? And then we stopped, okay? So you can see here in this figure, the 3 different cohorts. The blue line is the average gain in literacy score by the end of the third grade. And as you can see, it grows from 0.12 in 2015 cohort to 0.609 standard deviations in the third wave of the experiment. So why that happened? Well, why the results improve over time? There were a few things that happened between the first cohort and the last cohort. The first one is that we increased dosage. The second one is that we modified the eligibility rules. The third one is that we made some tweaks on the assignment of students to tutorial. Some of our tutors came back, so they accumulated experience, and there was quite a bit of fine-tuning of the materials by the local experts. So in the paper, we tried to explore what is it that explains the gains, and what seems to be driving the gains is the increase in dosage, and that comes from the fact that we increased the number of tutorials from the first year to the following years, and we were better at when somebody was missing one of these sessions, of offering remedial session. So basically, most of the kids managed to finish in the second and third cohorts of the experiment the whole program. The other things, there's no much heterogeneity in the program, in the results, and based on any of these other characteristics that I described here. So we think that the improvement that we see from the second to the third cohort is driven by the fine-tuning of the materials, though quantitatively we cannot assess that. So to conclude, and hopefully be in time, so small group tutorials were successful at offering remediation and increasing student literacy, and those gains were sustained over time. I think that this is important as we go forward in the region and kids come back to school in February or in January or whenever that is. We need to ask, like Mercedes said at the beginning, we need to assess where the kids are at the beginning of the school year, and if they are falling behind, we have to offer remediation. And this is an example of how you can successfully organize remediation in reading. Similar things can be done in math. There is another interesting lesson about the paper, which is this sequence of experiments that led us to interact with the people in the field that were doing the program, the Fundación Luker and the Secretaría de Educación de Manizales, which led to improvement over time. And I think that this is something that we should do more in the profession. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami, very much for this great presentation. Francisco, the floor is yours.
Yeah, one more thing. If the paper is recently out, if you want to download it, it's down there. Okay, I forgot to say that.
Thank you, Sami. Francisco?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, can you see the presentation?
Yes, Francisco, we can see that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
The only thing, Francisco, if you want to, we can see the notes as well. So exactly, yeah, if you.
Okay, let me see. Swap me there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. So today I'm gonna present a paper that was done together with Emmanuel Vasquez and Melissa Adelman, where we basically evaluate the impact of a scalable early warning system to prevent dropout in Guatemala. And we use a 4,000 school randomized control trial. So as you know, school dropout is a major problem across middle and low income countries. And in particular in LAC, there are more than 13 million of primary and secondary kids that are out of school. And actually some simulations estimate that there could be a 15% increase during the current context. And this is bad news because we know from global evidence that school dropout is strongly associated to multiple outcomes that we care, including higher probability of committing violent crimes and lower wages, happiness, health outcomes, and so on, productivity. In particular, in Guatemala, it has one of the largest school dropout rates in LAC. While schooling is compulsory until grade 9, almost 1 out of 3 kids drop out in the transition from primary to lower secondary. While some interventions have shown promise around the world to reduce dropout, the constrained resources in countries like Guatemala, sometimes the inaccurate targeting of these scarce resources and scalable interventions. And we know that the evidence for developing countries on effective low-cost interventions that has been implemented at scale is a bit limited. So here is where we're going to have some contribution with this paper. So basically what we did is we worked very closely with the Ministry of Education of Guatemala, Minedu, and we designed a very low-cost program called ENTRE, Estrategia Nacional para la Transición Exitosa, which cost less than $3 per student. So it was super cheap. The program was aimed at reducing school dropout from in the transition from primary to lower secondary by providing simple tools and very practical information to two key actors, the school principals and the sixth grade teachers. So we implemented this in 2018 at scale in 3,000 public primary schools. This is almost 20% of the schools of Guatemala. Very importantly, we use the existing institutional structure of Minedu. So this means their own supervisor, their own trainers, their own teachers and school principals. So this is very critical to implement this at scale, and it's what allows us to do it at such large scale. So we evaluated the impacts on school dropout about 8 months after the intervention started using this 4,000 school 4-arm RCT. And the main data we used was a very large student level panel that links students' administrative records throughout the years. And this is a great data that Guatemala has since 2011. And overall, we find that the intervention was effective. The school assigned to the program reduced dropout rate by 4%. This is 1.3 percentage points. And preliminary calculations suggest that the impact for compliers is almost twice as large. We're still working on that. And the program was not only effective, but importantly, highly cost effective. So the internal rate of return that we estimate is 28%, and the benefits cost ratio is 19 to 1. Okay, so very quickly, this is the intervention, the outline for the rest of the talk, where I'm gonna talk about the intervention, the critical strategy, and very quickly about the results and some key takes away. So entry target, as I mentioned, school principals from primary schools and also sixth grade teachers. And we have like 3 main components. The first one was the guide and a short training. The second one was a list of students at risk. And the final component were some reminders and behavioral now. So basically, we try to target 3 different challenges. First is that some school actors might not know how to prevent dropout. The other hypothesis was that some school actors might not know who is at risk of dropping out. And the final hypothesis, or the final challenge that we try to address, is that some actors may know how to prevent dropout or who is at risk, but maybe they don't prioritize dropout among many competing tasks. And this is coming from focus group with the school principal, from previous studies, from interviews with public officials, and so on. But I won't have time to go into the details. But basically, we have some hints to this challenge, and these are the ones that we try to address with our program. So for the first challenge, what we did basically is we prepared
Francisco, yeah, I was Marta. It's the same for me. I was trying to see if it was me, but it seems that we lost Francisco.
He dropped out.
Yeah, I think so. We lost him. So for the sake of time, I think he was halfway. I don't know if he will be able to reconnect shortly. Otherwise, what we can do is to we can wait for 1 more minute, and otherwise we can move into Marta's presentation until he's able to reconnect. So Marta, get ready just in case. Martha, for the sake of time, I think we can start with your presentation and then Francisco can finish his, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Let me then share my screen.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right. So please tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes, that's perfect, Martha.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good. All
Super.
right, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to this early morning session. And it's a pleasure to be here presenting a new study from the World Bank, the Fast Track to New Skills, Short Cycle Higher Education Programs in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is joint work with my World Bank colleagues, Lilith Dinarte and Marina Bassi, and with Sergio Ursua from the University of Maryland. So let me begin by saying what are short cycle higher education programs. So in general, there are two types of higher education programs. First, bachelor's programs, which in Latin America last from 4 to 6 years, and then short cycle programs that last 2 or 3 years. Short cycle is the UNESCO denomination. And these short cycle programs go by different names in different countries of the region. In some countries, they're called programas técnicos, tecnológicos, carreras terciarias, carreras cortas. In Brazil, they are the cursos tecnólogos. When you graduate from one of these programs, you get a degree, a technician, professional technician, specialist. And in the United States, these short cycle programs give you an associate's degree, and they're usually taught at community colleges. What's important is that short cycle programs are 2 or 3 years long. They are not 2 weeks or 2 months long. What is distinctive of these programs? They are less theoretical, much more practical than bachelor's programs. They're very oriented towards the labor market. They might give a pathway towards a bachelor's program. And depending on the country, they're offered by universities and or other institutions, typically higher education institutions. These programs are a big promise for the region. And the reason is that they form skilled human capital fast. And they do that in traditional fields, the fields where they started, like electronics, hospitality, nursing, but also in more innovative fields like cybersecurity, data science, nanotechnology. They're attractive to many students, people that have little interest in a bachelor's program or little time, few resources, little academic readiness, but also they are interesting for people who are just seeking new skills, even after a bachelor's degree, later in life. They're also attractive to employers. So World Bank surveys tell us that finding qualified employees is a struggle for 24% of the employers in the world and for 32% of the employers in LAC. LAC is the region that struggles the most to find qualified employees. And of course, this tells us about a disconnect between what the educational system produces on the one hand and what the productive sector demands on the other hand. And yet, despite all of this attractiveness, there's a stigma associated with short cycle programs in the region. Now, in the region, there's been a great higher education expansion in the new millennium. We're going to look here at higher education gross enrollment rate that basically measures the percent of individuals between 18 and 24 years old who are enrolled in higher education. So we're doing this for 2000, 2017, various regions of the world as a whole, and clearly higher education has grown throughout the world, but in the region, the growth has just been staggering. Enrollment rates have more than doubled in less than 20 years, which is very good news from the point of view of access. However, despite this expansion, there are relatively few students in short cycle programs. So this time we are looking among all higher education students, what percent is enrolled in short cycle programs for 2000, 2017, the various regions of the world. And in our region, that percent was already low, but it's even lower now. It's 9% of all higher education students, which is clearly one of the lowest shares of the world. In other words, that higher education expansion was biased towards bachelor's and against short cycle programs. Short cycle programs are attended by more disadvantaged, less traditional students than bachelor's programs. So we're going to compare the average student in both programs. And we see that short cycle programs tend to attend students who are a little older, higher fraction of women, less likely to live in cities, more likely to be married and have family responsibilities, more likely to be working while they study, and more likely to come from low and middle income households. And yet, despite this disadvantage, SCPs have higher completion rates than bachelor's programs. So here we're looking at completion rates for bachelor's and short cycle programs in all the regions, in all the countries of the region, and in most of those countries, completion rates are higher for short cycle than bachelor's programs, and the same thing is true for the region on average. Furthermore, graduating from a short cycle program is better than starting and not finishing a bachelor's program. So here we're going to look at labor market outcomes by educational attainment, starting with the unemployment rate. So we are going to compare outcomes for high school graduates, people with an incomplete short cycle program, a complete short cycle program, an incomplete bachelor's, and a complete bachelor's. And clearly those who graduated from a short cycle programs do better in terms of unemployment than those that just stopped in high school, but they also do better than those who started and didn't finish a bachelor's program. Same pattern emerges when we look at formal employment, and when we look at the additional wage relative to high school graduates. This figure tells us that somebody with a short cycle degree makes on average 45% more than somebody with just a high school diploma, but a person with an incomplete bachelor's makes only 28% more. Now, these results are very interesting because half of all higher education students in our region are these people who start but don't finish a bachelor's program. So at least for some of them, it has to be the case that these short cycle programs are a better option than bachelor's programs. Now, that was the average overall countries. What happens when we look at individual countries? Well, what we find is that across countries, this short cycle program premium varies, but generally is positive. So this time we're going to look at something a bit more refined, mean Syrian returns to an SCP degree relative to a high school diploma. And then clearly these returns vary across countries, but they are positive. And when we look at Syrian returns relative to bachelor's dropouts, we find that in most countries they are positive, and in Peru and Chile they are slightly negative, but in fact these estimates are not significantly different from zero. Now, these are good averages. However, these returns to short cycle program vary greatly among programs, but the same thing is true about bachelor's programs. So here we're going to look at total lifetime net returns in Chile. For every single short cycle and bachelor's program in Chile, we're going to compute the total lifetime net returns. And we're going to look at them by field of study. So what this tells me is that the average short cycle program in engineering and technology gives me about 40% more over a lifetime in salaries, net of the cost of obtaining the program, relative to just a high school diploma. So clearly the average return varies across fields. Furthermore, the returns vary among programs within the field, as we can see when we look at the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile within field. But the same thing is true for bachelor's programs, such that the average program in engineering and technology is in fact offers higher returns than most bachelor's programs in social sciences or in education and humanities. So this tremendous dispersion in returns among short cycle and bachelor's programs is an enormous source of risk for an uninformed student. Also, short cycle programs have a dynamic supply. So here we're going to look at some indicators of this for Colombia, starting with the average program life. In other words, on average, how many years go by since a program is first offered until it's closed down. And so comparing short cycle and bachelor's, a short cycle program on average is offered for about 7 years, but a bachelor's almost twice as much, 14 years. In any given year, about 21% of short cycle programs are new. They open just a year, much lower fraction for bachelor's. And in any given year, there's about 17 or 18% of short cycle programs that close, much lower fraction for bachelor's. So in other words, there's a lot more churn in the market of short cycle than bachelor's program. Why is that? So in a background paper, in a companion paper, we were able to establish that this is because short cycle programs respond faster than bachelor's programs to the needs of the local market. And so, for example, if this year there is a surge in the demand for people with an understanding of data science in Cali, Colombia, we're more likely to see new short cycle programs in response to this demand than new bachelor's programs. And this is very important, of course, especially in this time when the labor market is churning so fast, particularly during the pandemic. Now, we just saw that only some programs are good. And the question is, Why? What makes them be good? And by good, I mean programs that give good outcomes, controlling for student characteristics. So a good program is a high value added program. And so to answer this question, we designed and implemented a very novel survey, unique in the World Bank Short Cycle Program Survey. So we interviewed more than 2,000 program directors in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Brazil, the states of Sao Paulo and Ceará, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, and licensed programs in Peru. And we got an unusually high response rate, 70%, even though half of the survey took place during the pandemic. And this survey covered a very, very broad variety of topics. So people, directors answered questions about many things, including links with industry, job search assistance. So in other words, they told us about their practices, what it is that they do. And they also told us about the academic outcomes and labor market outcomes of their students. And for a couple of these survey countries, we were able to supplement with student level data, individual level data on student backgrounds and outcomes, labor market outcomes. Okay, so we got a wealth of data from this survey. What I want to show you now are some stats that illustrate how connected these short cycle programs are with the private sector, because I think that's a key area of differentiation relative to bachelor's programs, especially in our region. So about almost all of the programs have some kind of internship agreements with firms, many of them collecting data on their graduates' employment. They have firms helping them design the curriculum, student evaluation, they lease equipment to the programs, they help train the teachers. Also, the programs are assessing what the local firms need. They're also assessing whether the employers are happy with their graduates or not. And they also get involved in helping the students find jobs. So they give them information about the labor market, they train them for job interviews, sometimes they arrange the job interviews, or they run some kind of employment center. And so now, with all of these data on outcomes and program practices, we can answer the question of what do good programs do? And we learned that graduates get a higher chance of a formal job, and they also get higher salaries when they attend programs that have more links with industry, as we described, more job search assistance, adequate infrastructure, labs, workshops, equipment, so that they can do practical training. When they have academic remediation, which is very often needed in these programs, and it happens during the program. So this is reminiscent of the thing that Sami was discussing. When the program teaches numerical competencies, when there is a pathway towards a bachelor's program afterwards, and when the program hires faculty that has industry experience. So the upshot is that good programs are not random programs. They are programs that apply very intentional practices towards the success of their students. And this is good news, because it means that applying these practices could, in principle, improve the outcomes of the programs and close the gap between these really good and really bad programs. So in a good system, only good short cycle programs would be offered, and students would have the interest and the means to attend them. And so the question is, how can we build this system? So a few policies for a good system. First, collect and disseminate information on short cycle programs and on bachelor's programs. Ideally, students should be able to know for every single program offered in the country how much it costs, what is the employability, how much people make with that degree, what are the chances of success, what do you need to succeed in that program. This is critical for the students and their families when they're making decisions. They need the information early on, but also for the regulator. You can't regulate an industry for which you have no data. We have to oversee and regulate programs and institutions. So the region has oscillated between not regulating them at all and perhaps regulating them too much or the wrong way. And so we're advocating for a regulation that is based on student labor market outcomes. That's critical. Inputs and processes matters, but outcomes matter perhaps more. And at all costs, avoid the existence of programs with very bad outcomes. Close them. They don't do any good to anybody. Help finance these programs. The main reason for student dropout is financial struggle. And yet, there are more public subsidies for bachelor's than short cycle students, even though short cycle students are more disadvantaged. And so we need to reallocate public funding across students, across programs, bachelor's and short cycles, across institutions. In some countries, these short cycle programs are almost all private, but there is no financial aid whatsoever for those students. And across fields, because some fields have a higher production cost, like the technology fields. Also, we have to facilitate educational pathways. We have to start thinking of educational programs as collections of modules and give students a credential for every module they complete so that they can learn throughout their lives and accumulate credentials until perhaps a bachelor's program, if that's what they want. And so the idea, the vision here is that in a system where people have information about these programs, where the worst programs are not in the market, where people have the means to attend these programs and the programs are well funded, and where you might be able to continue to a longer degree if you choose to do so, the stigma of these short cycle programs would be much lower. And so at this critical juncture, the region is seeking different outcomes. I think there is broad agreement that our educational system is not delivering what we want and what we need. But in order to have different outcomes, we need different policies and strategies. I think we've gone for a long time with the illusion that we can obtain different outcomes doing always the same thing. And that's just an illusion. And we need to implement these policies and strategies urgently. Now is the time for short cycle programs. If not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And I see that now Francisco is with us. So Francisco, I know you left halfway your presentation. Marta, thank you very much. It was super insightful, the report and the presentation. Thank you for that. And Francisco, you can continue where you left.
Okay, sorry, they collapsed my computer.
Yeah, we figured that out. Thank you.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. I think I have a message that says it's not possible to share because it's disabled for participants. Maybe I use the wrong link. Oh. Let me see.
Francisco, in case you cannot connect the presentation, maybe you can continue. I think you were a little bit over halfway of the presentation. In case you cannot do that, you can just share with presentation.
Yes, sorry, I cannot share. Maybe I can send you, sorry, 1 second. Let me see if I find the, I apologize.
No problem.
I'm gonna connect with another link, sorry, just 1 second, because it's disabled for participants. Oh, here I can, okay, great. Can you see the?
Yeah, we can see the slide is not on presentation mode, but we can see the slide a little bit, and now it's good.
Nice, good. Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I think I left here, right? And so basically, we have 3 challenges that we identified. One was how to some school actors might not know how to prevent dropout. And here what we did is that we prepared a short guide, 13 pages of text to make sure that the teachers and the principals actually read the material because they have a little time. And so this guide basically described the key barriers for school enrollment, practical, meaning actionable recommendations that were feasible to implement by the school team. I already mentioned a bit about this, but this was complemented with half-day trainings, only 4 hours of training, that has an initial short lecture covering the key aspects of the guide, and a small group exercise, including role play and discussion to practice how they would implement this in their own school. Then we also, to inform this, that some school might not know who is at risk of dropping out, we prepared a list of students at risk at the school level. And the list was obtained by combining a linear probability model with some simple concepts from the prediction theory. And we have another paper that showed that this worked very well in the context of Guatemala. It's comparable to some of the best early warning systems that are out there. And finally, for the third challenge, that is that some school actors might not prioritize dropout prevention. What we did is we sent 5 monthly reminders through CIDE, which is an online portal that the school principal use very regularly. And this message used various behavioral concepts to motivate action, things like salience, social recognition, and loss frame. We use those concepts to design the reminders and the message. Okay, this is a quick snapshot of how the component look like. I just want to say that the training and the guide was by far the most expensive. It took about 90% of the total cost of the program, and we trained more than 4,100 teachers and school principals. Okay, this is the timeline for the activities. And so the school year began in January in Guatemala, and then our intervention, the training took place in early June of 2019. And in this training, we also distribute the list of students at risk. And then the school principals and teachers have about 4 to 6 months to implement the activities or the exercise that they learn in this training. And through this time period, we send the reminders through the CIDE portal. Basically, the 2 data points that we are going to use is a baseline that was collected before the intervention started, and an endline that is 8 months after the intervention started. And so we are going to rely mostly on an administrative student data set that is compiled by the Ministry of Education, which include the student identifiers that allow to track students since 2011, demographic information, grades, and enrollment status that capture dropouts. And we also conducted 3 surveys, 2 online and 1 paper-based, which allow us to investigate the mechanisms, but today I'm going to focus most on the administrative data. Okay, so very quickly, this is our how we design our multi-arm RCT. So we selected 4,000 schools and divided them into 4 groups. And the first group is treatment 1, that receive only the guide and the training. The second group is the same as treatment 1, but they also got the list of students at risk. The third treatment group is receive treatment 2, but we also add the reminder. So we are basically adding 1 component at a time, and then we have a pure control group. And so we have these 4,000 schools that were randomly allocated to these 4 buckets, 1,000 schools in each of the buckets. Okay, very quickly, in terms of balance at baselines, difference in all pre-treatment administrative variables are shown insignificant, but the sample is a bit biased against treatment schools. We have a bit of a higher dropout rate at baseline. So in the regressions, what we do is we control by student level variables, which includes also the probability of the dropout. And we also have a school fix effects because we are exploiting the fact that we have repeated cross-sections. Okay, so in terms of implementations, as you can see here, I'm going very quickly, sorry, but we have a very strong first stage for all components, but also some challenge with take-up and contamination. In particular, 80% of the treatment arm received the guide, about 2/3 of T2 and T3 got the list of the students at risk, and all the people in T3 got the reminders, but only 80% timely saw the first reminder. And we also have some issues in terms of contamination, as you can see here, in particularly for the guide and the list. And so in this presentation, I'm going to focus on intent to treat estimate, but given that this implementation challenge, you can see that we might be considerably underestimating the impact for compliers, and this is indeed what we're finding with some preliminary estimation, sorry. So very quickly, the summary of the key points of our empirical strategy, we exploit the randomized assignment to treatment, and we also include a school and year fixed effect and a student covariate because we have the repeated cross-sections. Then the unit of analysis will be the student, and the main outcome will be dropout coming from administrative records. We estimate both a pool model where we pull all the treatment groups in one dummy, and then a multi-arm model where we have different dummies for each treatment group. Very quickly, the snapshot of the result. So we find that on average, the school assigned to treatment reduce, the student in school assigned to ENTRE reduce the probability of dropout by 1.3 percentage points. And this was pretty much the same across treatment arms. And this is basically telling us that the main component driving the results is the training and the guide, which was the one that was common across treatment arms. So basically the practical information on how dropout can be addressed. Then we look at heterogeneity for different dimensions. We look at by pretreatment, dropout rates by school size and by gender. And we find that the impact was much larger for a student with high risk of dropout, for students in larger schools, and for boys. And this was pretty much the same across the different treatment arms. The only exception was the difference by gender. I don't have time, unfortunately, to show you, but we have some very suggestive evidence that there might be biased perception of risk for the teachers and the principals against girls, and that we might have a correct part of that when we give the information on who is at risk. But I don't have time, unfortunately, to show that today. So we tested our identification assumption. Basically, what we did is that we ran the same regressions that 1 year before when the program didn't exist. And so in here, the green bars are the real experiments and the blue bars are the placebos. And you can see we are getting nothing in the placebos. So basically, this is make us feel very confident about our identification strategy. We also look at some mechanisms using self-reported data from school directors. And this is what we found. So the first column here is showing the impact 2.5 months after the implementation started. And the last column, this is the last thing I'm going to show you, then the conclusion. And then the last column is the impact 8 months after the implementation. And what we found very quickly is that some short-term motivation or information effects. So for instance, 2 months after the implementation started, school principal report lower expectations for dropouts and higher expected returns for education. This was part of the content of the training, but this sort of vanished in the long term. And then they report much more prioritization of dropouts that tend to persist. And in particularly, they report a much targeted support to students. And this is very large. This is 0.6 standard deviation, which is huge, but it tends to persist, but the intensity is lower in the longer term. So the key takes away, do I have 1 minute?
Actually, Francisco, we are over time by 2 minutes already. So if we could just maybe move into I mean, I would like to have at least 5 minutes Q&A if you are okay with that, and maybe we can share with the participants. We can share your email addresses, and they can be in contact with you and read the great paper and continue the conversation there if that's okay.
Sure. Sorry.
So. Great, thank you, the three of you, Sami, Francisco, Marta, for your presentations. I would like to open the floor, even if we are a little bit over time, to Q&A questions. Is anybody have a question on the papers? I don't see anything. Maybe I can start with one, just for the sake of opening it. Let's start with Francisco, since you finished. So the early warning system, I really like that approach, and the fact that you have that you have rigorous evidence on the impact of these kind of programs. And so it's a promising cost-effective approach for reducing dropout in primary school. And the other interesting thing is that we are working, you guys are working on a resource constrained context like Guatemala. So that both the combination of two things it's pretty interesting. But dropout is also a challenge in the region. in middle and high school particularly. So the question for you would be, do you think this program could be effective in other grade levels and context, and why not?
That's a very good point, and that was part of the conversations we were having with the government on whether to expand to other grades. I think what this one was super specific and focused on like low hanging fruits, which was a bit of motivation. Particularly, I think the most important thing was that kind of motivating the kids and try to also motivate the teachers to get involved in the process and the school principal. To that extent, I think it's applicable to other levels. And in particular, I think in our case, we are focusing on transition. So I think it could be useful in the transition from lower secondary to upper secondary. I think that some of these concepts have been used in those transitions as well. So I think for that is relevant. But as you say, it's a very cost effective, but you shouldn't expect like a large change in terms of dropout. There is much many other factors that have to be addressed in terms of supply and income and so on. But yes, just to make it sure, I think it's useful, but you shouldn't expect like a super big change. I think you're mute.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. So I see a question in the chat now. So Oscar is asking a question to Marta. Could you say something about program costs relatively to bachelor's and technical education? And he also has a question to Francisco, how to identify the list of students at risk. So Marta, you're gonna start?
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, for your question. So, so the question is about program costs related to bachelor's and technical. So just to be clear, in many countries, short cycle programs are technical education. So just to be clear about that, they are higher technical education. So on average, short cycle programs are less expensive per year than bachelor's programs. And of course, the whole program is also less expensive because it's shorter. Now, having said that, across countries, the costs vary tremendously. In Brazil and Peru, they're actually quite expensive because they're private. There's almost no public provision in those places. Whereas in countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, where there's more public provision, the average cost is lower. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, and really appreciate the time, the short answer. Francisco.
Okay, sure. Very quickly, we have another paper that is about that, the prediction, and that is available on the World Bank website. But I can share with Oscar. But basically, what we do is we have in Guatemala we have great data because you have a panel, a student level panel that follow kids around from 2011 across all grades, and so you can sort of predict the probability of dropping out based on observable variables like grades, socio-demographic conditions, and which school you go, and so on. And so you can estimate these models, and then what you do is you try different sort of cutoff for the probability to say that they are at risk of dropping out or not. You use an algorithm that you try different cutoff, and select the option that is optimal in terms of that it has the lower false alarms and the higher sensitivity rates. And so you can see that with the data, you test out of sample, and then that's kind of your model that you use to predict dropout. So if it was a bit quickly, we'll have another paper with more details on how we did it.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco. So I think we're going to stop here. It's 9:48. I don't want to take more of anybody's time. So thank you so very much to the panelists. It's been the papers are extremely interesting, useful, and relevant at this time. And thank you for all the participants for being here, for being active listeners, and also for the questions that you had. I'm sorry that we didn't have any more time, but I'm sure you can continue the conversation with the authors. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Sami.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you all.